Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Philip Bloom. I'm the June and Simon Casey Lee Curator of the Chinese Garden and the Director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies here at the Huntington. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's talk by Michael Hatch. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'd like to express my particular thanks to the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for supporting our lecture series and our other programs for the Chinese Garden. Before the talk begins, please just take note of the emergency exits marked in red, and please also turn any noise-making devices that you might have with you to silent mode. So as many of you may know, the Huntington actually began this series of East Asian garden lectures exactly 20 years ago. June Lee first started organizing these lectures in 2005. Some years we've organized the series around particular themes, such as our celebration of medicinal plants last year and our celebration of the Shoya House the year before. This year's series will be a bit more eclectic, but I think it actually will be all the more exciting because of its eclecticism. The topics will range from medieval Chinese medicine to the place of Asian plants and Asian American horticulturalists in the landscapes of Southern California, from the Chinese inspirations of the oldest Japanese garden-making manual to boats and gardens as spaces for artistic creation. Today we're going to begin with the curious relationship between the visual arts and the sense of touch in 19th-century China. This was a new sensory interest that really as you'll see, brought together everything from ancient tiles to the potted plants that are known as penjing. It's my pleasure then to welcome this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Michael J. Hatch, to lead us through the surprising confluence of vision and sight. Dr. Hatch is Associate Professor of Fine Arts at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, where he's taught since 2024. Previously, he was Associate Professor in Art and Architectural History at Miami University in Ohio. He received his PhD in Chinese art history from Princeton, and his scholarship addresses Chinese art from the 18th through the 21st centuries. As you'll hear today, he has particular interests in materiality and sensory history. His first book, Networks of Touch, A Tactile History of Chinese Art, which I had intended to have as a prop, but is sitting in my bag, describes the early 19th century obsession with epigraphy in China. It examines in particular how epigraphy shaped a form of tactile thinking that transformed visual and material culture, and it was published by Penn State University Press in 2024. His upcoming projects include a co-edited volume on the exchange of antiquarian knowledge across early modern East Asia, and he's also thinking about a book, or at least an article, on the effects of linearity on brushwork in modern Chinese painting. Besides his academic work, Professor Hatch also writes art criticism for a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, where he now publishes 4 to 5 reviews of Asian art exhibitions every year. At the same time, Professor Hatch is a remarkably thoughtful teacher. He says that he, in his own words, seeks to direct the curiosity that artworks spark in students toward larger conversations that bridge differences in time, culture, and language. He sees art history as a set of methods and tools that enable students to understand how their attention is stimulated, to excavate historical and cultural contexts beyond those immediately available to them, and to open up new possibilities of being in the present. As you likely can tell from this brief description of Professor Hatch's work, he very much embodies the breadth of curiosity and generosity of spirit that a liberal arts education is intended to foster. I had the great fortune to first meet him at Middlebury College more than 20 years ago, when he was the teaching assistant for the first class on Chinese painting that I ever took. From the moment we met, I was struck precisely by the diversity of his interests and by his seeming self-comfort, that is, his ease with himself regardless of the circumstances. He's someone who has attended technical school in Sweden, who studied painting in a Chinese art academy, who worked in a Beijing auction house when there were very few foreigners around, and who spends his free time skiing and bike camping. I've had the continued fortune to learn from Professor Hatch on multiple occasions these past 20 years, despite our rarely having been in the same place for very long. A talk he gave on notions of brushwork and line in Chinese painting actually completely transformed how I understand that art form. So today I'm delighted that Professor Hatch is here to share what grows from old bricks, the tactile arts of early 19th century China. The talk will last approximately 45 minutes, then we'll have time for questions and answers. If you're watching online, please feel free to post questions into the chat box and I'll pose them to Professor Hatch myself. If you're here in the audience, you'll see that we have 2 microphones for questions after the talk. The talk will be recorded and posted on the Huntington's website. So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Hatch.
Thank you very much for that generous and kind introduction, Philip. And thank you to the Huntington for hosting me today. Thanks to Michelle Bailey for coordinating this trip, and especially to Philip for inviting me to speak here. As Dr. Philip Bloom has mentioned, he and I have known each other since around the time we both began our history of studying Chinese art, just over 20 years ago. And I really do feel honored to be here now at the invitation of someone whom I respect so much as a very careful thinker and whom I appreciate as a generous colleague. Thank you very much, Philip. I think we should begin today locally, in the Huntington's Chinese gardens. For those of you who are familiar with the various sections of the Suzhou-style garden, you may recognize this view from the Cloudy Forest Court, within the verdant microcosm section of the gardens, a place where visitors are treated to one of the more delightful traditions of Chinese garden culture, an arrangement of so-called potted scenes or penjing. Over decades, the shrubs in these shallow ceramic vessels are pruned, bent, trained, and pampered, so that they can emulate the grander forms of giant forests, only on a much more manageable and relatable scale. They bring the outside landscape close, making it intimate through prolonged processes of mindfulness, paying close attention to the material and ecological needs of the plant so that it might be crafted into an ideal vision of the world that reflects a human understanding of its natural patterns. Oh, hey now, that's not how that's supposed to work. Hey, all right. At first glance, this hand scroll, dated to 1835, appears to depict part of a garden much like the one here at the Huntington. As the hand scroll unrolls from right to left, it presents the viewer with a sequence of rectangular and square basins of varied sizes, arranged in a row within the shallow foreground of the image. The rough, monochromatic surfaces of these containers contrast with the smooth washes and jewel-like tones of the different plants that appear to grow from them. The painting was even created at Suzhou's famous Sanglang Pavilion, one of the city's most renowned scholarly gardens, and an inspiration for the Huntington's own Chinese garden. Unlike the Huntington's very real display of penjing, however, this set of miniature garden landscapes is entirely fictional. The flowers, evergreens, mosses, and lichens seen here were not planted in any such containers at the Sanglang Pavilion, nor were their images likely to have been painted from life there. In fact, they were not even the primary subject of this painting. Instead, that honor goes to the parts of the image that we see as planters, which are also neat little fictions of a sort, because they are composed of carefully arranged rubbings taken from the text-bearing faces of antique bricks. When the hand scroll's author, an itinerant monk and scholar of ancient inscriptions named Liu Zhou, was invited to Suzhou by Chen, the governor of Jiangsu province, it was to document that governor's brick collection. The hand scroll Liu Zhou provided to Chen in the summer of 1835 archived just 12 of his most prized bricks in a series of ink rubbings. But rather than using the common approach of rubbing the inscription faces of each brick in a linear archive of flat impressions down the hand scroll, Liu Zhou implemented a relatively new process for depicting antiquities called full form, or composite rubbings, which was specially formulated to convey the three-dimensional nature of an object in a two-dimensional format. Liu Zhou began with renderings of the text-bearing faces of each brick, which he carefully arranged at right angles to one another, overlapping them in a way that obscured the inscriptions sometimes in favor of a more engaging composition. After he completed this stage of the work, a selective group of Chen and Liuzhou's friends was gathered, fellow collectors, monks, and various favored aides who were also interested in epigraphy, the study of ancient inscriptions. Each was invited to add a painting to one of the 12 rubbings laid out in the composition. Huang Jun began this progression of in-painted bouquets with a vignette of rocks and bamboo, done in the style of the famous 14th-century painter Nizan, and shown to be growing forth from the interior of a long molded brick, originally made somewhere around the late 3rd century. Continuing down the length of this rubbing, 2 more bricks appear as if nestled within the first. One of these rubbings shows the truncated text of a 1st century reign date, Yuan Kang, 5th year, and is supported on a small table. Orange calendula blooms from it. The other, a rubbing of a slender vertical brick, carries only a partial inscription of 2 characters, intentionally rubbed in an incomplete manner so that the lower half is occluded by the side of the long brick within which it appears to stand. A withered pine branch, painted by Yongqiu, bends up and over the lip of the vertical rubbing, splitting to the left as a second offshoot peeks out from behind the brick. And more contributions follow. A lingzhi mushroom by the monk Shu Shi, a trio of flowering plum, fir, and pyracantha berries by Yao Ding, a taihu stone by Sung Yu Chao, and a narcissus by Chen Kanru. Oops, here we go, narcissus. And then a blossoming plum by Ji Yuji, an orchid and chrysanthemum by Liuzhou himself, and a rock among the grasses by Song Xi, who was Liuzhou's mentor at the Buddhist monastery where he was first trained to make rubbings. The small floral compositions that each participant brushed on top of and stemming from the rubbings transformed their ink surfaces from a collection of archival documents into a vibrant and social scene. Through a variety of painting styles and representing a full range of diverse auspicious flora, Chen's friends concretized their connections with him and with one another while gaining the cultural capital associated with the study of these remnants of the ancient past. When these painters finished their contributions, Liuzhou still had more work to do to finish the image. He added selective ink impressions of each brick's sides along diagonals, creating spatial depth with these orthogonal lines, and often in painting areas to smooth out transitions between surfaces or to fill in around the painted flowers, until the overall image presented Chen's collection as this fictional garden of potted landscapes, each nesting within or standing in front of another in a unified picture plane that gently receded away from the viewer. Now, the novelty of such images may not be apparent to us as modern viewers, but for early 19th century elite audiences, Liuzhou's hybrid rubbing paintings were startling and evocative. Yuan Yuan, a political juggernaut of the early 19th century and another patron of Liuzhou, described the surprise of seeing one of these full-form rubbings done for him. He said, "From it, one can see the entire form of the bronze. Looking at this is as if looking at the original vessel." Elsewhere, on another rubbing, he marveled, "The dimensions of the image are true. I've held the original bronze in my hands." Yuan's comments stand out because within the elite literati arts of late imperial China, images rarely aimed to reproduce a sense of visual reality, much less a tactile one. But in these productions, the sense of touch was paired equally with vision to convey the pleasure of real interactions with antiquities. Full-form rubbings, like the one that Liuzhou made for Chen and Ruan, challenged the boundaries between the real and the fabricated, an ambivalence that audiences embraced. As prints made by direct contact with an object's surfaces, viewers perceived them to be truthful documentary records done with an apparent minimum of artificial interference on behalf of the maker. But as pictures, viewers also had to grapple with the nearly opposite effect, the obvious manipulation of the rubbings and the addition of painting that produced fictional scenes with spatial and affective dimensions. The unification of archival technologies with painterly processes in a single image confirmed direct sensory experiences of touch while encouraging imaginative visual projection, uncanny properties that made Liuzhou's pictures ideal devices for literati networking. The enthusiastic inscriptions and colophons added to them by elite Qing dynasty scholars attest to their dual roles of commemorating relationships to the revered objects of the past and providing a format to bond individuals in contemporary networks of knowledge and friendship. To understand how such hybrid rubbing paintings came together requires stepping back one generation further, to the turn of the century, when a shift in aesthetics began to occur. While Liu Zhou's work is remarkable, it was not the isolated product of an individual genius. It developed as part of a larger cultural phenomenon that emerged beginning in the late 18th century, a shift in visual thinking, instigated by the importance and popularity of epigraphy and reliant on the authority of direct physical contact with real objects of the world. Liu Zhou's work, like many of his contemporaries, presumed a fundamental visual, historical, and cultural knowledge of ancient inscriptions. The early 19th century popularity of epigraphy grew out of its usefulness to the larger intellectual turn of the mid-18th century, often described with the phrases evidential research or Han learning. Evidential researchers felt that a gap had grown up between the present knowledge of the Confucian classics and the true words of China's most important historical thinkers. They challenged the authenticity of the received canon and sought to reclaim a direct relationship with the past through the assiduous study and correction of textual recensions. By closely comparing the features of early Chinese language, including etymology, phonology, and graphology, they felt that they could ferret out later false versions of these texts and reinstate the true ones. These revisions were political by nature because the classical texts being amended also provided the fundamental rhetoric for elite social interaction and bureaucratic advancement. Evidential researchers emphasized evidence-based arguments grounded in authenticated and concrete sources, such as ancient inscriptions in stone, metal, and clay, like the ones that Chen collected and Liu Zhou documented. These proved invaluable because of their material durability, which gave greater historical certainty to the forms of language cut or cast into them. As evidential research networks expanded in the 18th century, hundreds of scholars produced thousands of tomes of text describing these early sources of language and reproduced tens of thousands of rubbings taken from the original objects, circulating them for comparison throughout the empire. The proliferation of interest in these objects instigated an epigraphic aesthetic in the work of late 18th and early 19th century artists, scholars, and artisans, as defined by the appropriation of stylistic material and tactile features from ancient inscribed objects like stone steles, bronze ritual vessels, and clay bricks, as well as the features of their primary reproductive technology, rubbings. In keeping with the principles of the evidential research practitioners who instigated this intellectual, social, cultural, political turn, the epigraphic aesthetic was also fundamentally about challenging the received canons, beginning with the calligraphic canon. Careful attention to the epigraphic aesthetic's effects across a range of materials likewise reveals another defining feature of this generation of artists, their remarkable interest in the sense of touch, a sensory turn that stemmed directly from the popularity of rubbings to document and exchange knowledge about epigraphy. As the early practitioner of evidential research, Yan Yuan, put it, things can be explained only by the tangible handling of them. To tell this story of the epigraphic aesthetic, its challenges to existing artistic and textual canons, and the generational turn toward tactile thinking with some degree of focus, I've centered my research and the rest of today's talk on several figures within one network of elites, loosely gathered around the public servant Ran Yuan, who was among the most influential and well-connected government officials of the early 19th century. In this painting by Zhou Zan, Ran Yuan is depicted in his studio in 1803, along with his friend Zhu Weibi and his adopted son, Ran Changsheng. His private collection of ancient bronze ritual vessels, weapons, and lamps, as well as earthenware bricks and carved inkstone, surrounds the three. Ran Yuan sits at the center of the image as the two other figures handle antiques from his collection. As if to emphasize this act of ancient bricks even appears to bear the handprint of its original anonymous maker. Yet this compelling portrait of a collector and his collection is only the prefacing image to a much longer hand scroll, the bulk of which, as it unrolls from right to left, reveals a series of over 90 rubbings, each documenting the text-bearing portions of the same bronze antiques depicted in the painting. Just as two of these men are painted in the act of taking pleasure in the green-blue patinated surfaces of the bronzes, so can a viewer of this hand scroll indulge in a similar surface contact with each famous object in Yuan's collection through the direct experiences of touch that the rubbings record. As one art historian has put it, this is a double portrait of Yuan's collection, first in painting and then in rubbings, And as I would add, it's first in a visual image, and second in terms of a tactile kind of image. At this point, Ren was a man on the rise. Just a few years earlier, he had assumed his first major post as provincial governor of Zhejiang province. He would go on to be the governor or governor general of 6 different provinces over his career, and he eventually earned the title of Grand Secretary in the Qing imperial palaces in Beijing. His steady rise to prominence was certainly predicated on his policy-making intelligence, but it was also built on a careful cultivation of cultural projects that gained him social capital among his contemporaries. Before moving to these gubernatorial roles, Ren spent back-to-back terms as educational commissioner, first of Shandong province and then of Zhejiang province. And in each position, he commissioned local scholars to compile and edit large, multi-volume compendia of the ancient inscribed monuments and resources of the province. This resulted in the publication of the 24-volume Epigraphy Gazetteer for Shandong province and the 18-volume Epigraphy Gazetteer for Zhejiang province, both of which were massive undertakings employing dozens of scholars. These endeavors affected Ren Yuan on a number of levels. For one, his employment of many underfunded scholars in these projects created a broad network of intellectual support that would serve him for the rest of his career. Epigraphy was a primary avenue for social networking among elites. By exchanging knowledge about the fragmented and difficult-to-read inscriptions found on ancient bronzes, bricks, and stones, scholars tested the depths of one another's understanding of the past and of their mutual bonds to one another. Another facet was the development of his own calligraphic style. In its most obvious form, the epigraphic aesthetic of this generation was seen in the emulation of one's own calligraphy of the ancient styles of writing found on stone monuments or cast in classical bronzes and circulated through rubbings. In this example, Ren Yuan has excerpted a section of the Yiying stele, which was first carved and erected in 153 CE. By Ren Yuan's time, the stone itself had been moved to the Temple of Confucius in Qufu because its inscription commemorated a petition to the Han Dynasty court, asking to establish a government official role in Qufu that would be responsible for the maintenance of proper Confucian rites, as well as necessary ritual implements at the temple. Ren Yuan's choice was not whimsical. It also helped to reinforce a positive impression of his personal character among his contemporaries. Brushing out the words anew, Ren Yuan paid homage to the original Han Dynasty event, while emphasizing his own commitment to proper Confucian ritual, the mainstay of imperial order since the Han Dynasty onward. In addition to this political signaling, Ren's marriage to a member of the Confucian lineage also gave a more personal dimension to his copying of this inscription in his own hand. But the most important aspect of Ren Yuan's efforts to catalog and understand all of these ancient monuments was the culmination of his knowledge in 2 essays, Southern and Northern Schools of Calligraphy, and Northern Steles and Southern Letters, which summarized the radical changes he and his peers enacted on the established calligraphic canon by means of so many anonymously engraved stones and bronzes from the deep past. The celebration of anonymity was groundbreaking in calligraphic culture. It decoupled the general style of a text from the personal biography of the calligrapher who made it, allowing for an entirely new canon that drew its authority from the direct contact with antique objects. Ren's essays also offer the clearest articulation of the terms and logic of the early 19th century epigraphic aesthetic. The essays, which were first drafted in 1810 to 1811, were made just after Ren Yuan completed his final term as the governor of Zhejiang province, but they were not published until 1823. In Southern and Northern schools, Ren Yuan began with a rhetorical question. How can we return to the ancients when the various currents in schools have become muddied and confused with all of these changes and transformations of calligraphy so that now we cannot trace them back to their original sources? His question reflected the central concern of evidential researchers, the evacuation of truth from the ancient past, despite the muddling effects of time and inaccurate recensions. Ren Yuan's answer to his own question, put simply, was that a comparative study of a wide array of ancient inscribed artifacts would reveal the real genealogies of calligraphy. As he went on to assert, for 20 years now I've been paying close attention to stele stones of the North and the South and confirming them in official histories. Traces of the flow of 2 schools are apparent among them. The Southern school has the airs of the Eastern Jin dynasty. It is free and loose, refined and exquisite, and it has been preserved in handwritten letters. where the strokes of characters are so abbreviated as to make them almost incomprehensible. The northern school, on the other hand, is that of the old methods of the heartland and is constrained and strict, as well as awkward and rough. It can be found most often now on carved stones and placards. While this particular excerpt seems to give a balanced view of the two stylistic lineages, Ren's allegiances really lay with the northern school. After listing the historical practitioners of each of these genealogies, he went on to argue that the northern history had been forgotten beginning in the Tang Dynasty, when imperial preference for the calligraphy of Wang Xizhi and his son Wang Xianzhi essentially occluded a vision of all of the northern styles altogether. By the Song Dynasty, Ren argued, scholars were ignorant of the difference between the southern and the northern schools. They thought the calligraphers of the early Tang all followed the tradition of Wang Xizhi and Wang Xianzhi. Ren's objection to the southern school therefore stemmed from its dominance at the expense of nearly all knowledge of the northern school. But they extended beyond this to broader characterological and material concerns. The styles of the southern school were also displeasing because they relied on cleverness and beauty in their appeals to their viewers. The northern school styles, on the other hand, were squared, strict, disciplined. For Ren and his colleagues, these stylistic descriptions conveyed personal affects and were open to moral judgments. A calligrapher who used his clever and appealing style of southern school calligraphy was, by nature, a showy person. In contrast, someone who used the awkward or unstudied and rough style of the northern school was said to have a more restrained personality. In the early 19th century, and among Ren's friends, the personal character associated with the northern style was preferred. It was seen as authentic, honest, less affected. To reach the knowledge conveyed in these essays required going back to ancient sources such as steles, bricks, and bronzes that had been carved or cast before this obfuscation of the northern school had taken place. By prizing the scripts of calligraphy found on steles from the deep past and often made by unknown artisans, evidential researchers and epigraphy aficionados divorced calligraphy from an overdetermined relationship to biographical stories. Instead of identifying characterological values with celebrated calligraphers, they raised up a new set of values, of being coarse and simple, or antique and awkward, for example. Values that drew on the material qualities of stone, ceramic, and bronze, including the signs of their age and decay. The authenticity of early texts was largely established through close attention to their material supports. Epigraphy specialists scrutinized corrosion, erosion, chipping, and fracturing in all types of stone and metal as key features for properly dating an object. Was the wear on the stone or bronze consistent throughout? Were there areas that had been retouched or altered over the years? Did extant objects accord with historical records of their text as found in classical rubbings or other published records? These debates filled the commentary sections of published catalogs on epigraphy, whether they were the multi-volume sets edited by Ren Yuan and his team, or individually published examples by scholars such as Huang Yi, whose books, engraved text of the Lesser Penglai Pavilion, published in 1800, reproduced woodblock printed images of his renowned collection of antique rubbings from famous ancient steles. Some of his rubbings dated to the 9th century and recorded more complete versions of the inscriptions that had been damaged or lost over time. For his printed reproductions of these rubbings, which were themselves, For his printed reproductions of these rubbings, which were themselves reproductions of the stone steles, Huang made the peculiar choice to use an outlining technique. This decision focused visual attention to the edges of characters where the material signs of degradation in stone were most pronounced, signaling the authenticity of the original inscribed text through the evidence of their material aging. But as you can see here, at times, Huang's fascination with reproducing the destruction of the text's material support created illegible, amoeba-like forms, nullifying the words as language and instead highlighting a growing fetishistic interest among epigraphy specialists in the surfaces of the object alone. The hollow shapes sometimes created by this technique often fail to simulate calligraphic brushwork entirely, emptying the inscriptions of any implied relationship to the actions of a specific calligrapher's body. Huang Yi's prints, when seen in relationship to Ren Yuan's essays, reinforced the desire in this generation to vacate established genealogies of calligraphic style and brushwork in favor of new canons based on material authority of anonymous ancient sources. The reuse of script styles may have been the clearest signs that Ren and his peers were harnessing the rising epigraphic aesthetic to personal effects in their calligraphy, but subtler material signs also manifested in ways that echoed Huang Yi's attention to the edge of the breakdown of characters in his rubbings, and by extension to the degraded stone surfaces from which they came. This occurred particularly at the boundaries of brush marks. Through a manipulation of ink viscosity, paper surface sizing, and slow brush movements, some 19th-century calligraphers, like Wu Xizai, allowed ink to bleed beyond the boundaries of the brushstroke, paying homage to the broken edges of Huang's emptied forms and borrowing the aura of material authority that came from their original sources. And I think you can see it in the reproduction here, the sort of center line where the brush has made the marks, and the way in which the paper absorbs the wetness of that ink mark and pulls the moisture outward to create that halo that simulates the effect of the rubbings that have been outlined in Huang Yi's texts. The overt fascination with aged surfaces and decayed archaic forms that underpin the epigraphic aesthetic in calligraphy moved to calligraphy's fellow brush-based art of painting, as well as to seal carving and to teapot production, as my later examples will show. In painting from the late 18th and early 19th centuries onward, artists like Luo Ping adopted archaic compositions from rubbings of carved images, such as this 9th century picture of the Arhat Nandamitra, which Luo used as the foundation for his portrait of Jinnong, his mentor. The illusion was not just iconographic, it was also material. The heavy, dark outer lines of the painted figure's robes stood out as strange and even awkward because they directly emulated the kinds of marks cut into stone surfaces to depict the Arhat image. For a contemporaneous viewer, following the dark ink rhythms of the creases and folds in the robe of Jinnong's outer garment would have been like running a hand over an organically deteriorating and roughly hewn surface of stone. When the poet Yuan Mei inscribed this painting, he began with his poem with the line, "Jinnong was like Gan Shi, who squandered gold. He dined on jade like Liu." Han Shi was a Taoist character who wasted masses of gold to find an alchemical means of manufacturing it. And Liu was an official from the Northern Wei dynasty who ate powdered jade to prolong his life. These allusions to gold and to jade reveal Yuan Mei's awareness that the metal and stone sources that fed the epigraphic craze were fundamentally visible in the very composition of the body of this figure, in both a metaphorical and a material sense. One ideal quality that painters and epigraphy connoisseurs pursued in ancient objects, as well as in their own work, was the so-called antique and awkward, and sometimes just awkward, zhuo, or untrained, aesthetic. To seek the antique and awkward or untrained involved bypassing the affectations inherent in citing canonical brush masters. Instead, a direct path was sought to the principles of the ancients through the purposeful manipulation of brushwork that alluded to the material properties of the inscriptions and images found in ancient stone and metal. Ren Yuan, Huang Yi, and many others used this phrase, gu zhuo, antique and awkward, to positively authenticate fragmented inscriptions from the past. The painter Chen, seen here on the left, was quite fond of using this phrase too. He found the ideal qualities of the awkward and antique in the set of stone-carved figures of the Han Dynasty that Huang Yi had rediscovered and made famous a generation earlier. And he recommended that others incorporate those forms into their painting, writing, "In making large figures in one's painting, one must grasp the antique and awkward concepts of the stone carving of the Wuliang shrine." The adaptation of the epigraphic aesthetic across the arts occurred in surprising ways as well, as in this handscroll painting that would at first glance appear to manifest none of the obvious traits that we've talked about so far. Made for Ren Yuan in 1803 by the landscape painter Wang Shuihao, presenting the tripod at Mount Jiao, commemorated Ren's donation of an important inscribed Han Dynasty bronze to a temple in Zhenjiang, an act that also showcases how revered these inscriptions and their objects were at the time. Wang painted the monochromatic landscape image in the canonical style of early Qing dynasty painters like Wang Hui and Wang Yuanqi. But as the later colophons added to the paintings show, when viewers saw this landscape, they not only viewed it through the lens of these orthodox lineages and canons of brushwork and landscape painting, they also visualized the surfaces of the bronze at the center of this narrative, which you can just barely make out on the boat in the center of the image. And they even added rubbings of that particular bronze to the image. suggesting that the epigraphic aesthetic affected a comprehensive shift in the perception of early 19th century art. One could look at a painting of a landscape and imagine the sight or touch of the surfaces of bronze. In these changes to the core literati practices of calligraphy and painting, the effects of the epigraphic were first and perhaps most pronounced, as scholars and artists reoriented the brush arts of calligraphy and painting toward new canons of style grounded in material features of authoritative early bronze, stone, and clay objects. Calligraphers changed character composition by adopting the orthography of early inscribed or cast texts, and they made material references to the textures of broken stone or corroded metal surfaces in order to signal their relationship to these authentic epigraphy sources. In painting, as we've just seen, purposely archaic compositions could harken back to the early modes of image construction, while dry, stippled brush marks and outlines simulated the material qualities of worn stone and metal surfaces as recorded in rubbings of ancient objects. But the epigraphic aesthetic was not just a stylistic choice. It affected deeper changes in the literati arts, encouraging a preoccupation with touch that moved across the primary mediums of this period. This is perhaps most visible in the work of Liu Zhou, who we started this lecture with, and whose work is also visible here on the screen at the moment. Liu Zhou's full-form rubbings astonished and pleased people like Ren Yuan and Chen Jian, especially when they were combined with this other method of painting. In many ways, the reduplicative technology of rubbings acted as the prime image model for early 19th century artists and scholars, challenging brushwork's long-standing role as the principal bearer of stylistic authority among literati artists. As images born directly from their object reference, rubbings could be appreciated as corporeal manifestations of antique objects and have been described in scholarship as shed skins or as akin to relics. I would argue that rubbings are best described not as skins, but as suspended perceptions of touch, as acts of direct apprehension of the world made available for the sensation of other viewing bodies. Touch was essential to both the culture of rubbings and the classical brushwork traditions of calligraphy and painting. Yet the sensation of touch was constructed and perceived quite differently in each. Whereas a viewer saw brushwork as a set of the artist's bodily traces left suspended in ink and paper, they understood rubbings as direct facsimiles of touch with an object's surfaces. Through one, audiences reconstructed the physical experiences and ideas of another person. Through the other, they bypassed human bodies altogether to touch the material world directly. The 19th century reorientation of touch away from the bodily traces of canonical brushwork artists and toward the direct surface sensations of art objects not only enabled early 19th century artists and scholars to move beyond stagnant brushwork genealogies, it also allowed them to move easily between mediums, to conjoin previously separate image-making practices, and to reassert the role of the senses as a primary means by which audiences could engage with artworks. But what then happens to viewing conventions in each medium? How factual was a composite rubbing with painted figures or flowers to an epigraphy aficionado? Conversely, for a viewer accustomed to the principles of viewing brushwork as the transmission of the artist's thoughts and bodily gestures, did images like Liu Zhou's qualify as paintings? Are these even the right questions to ask? Perhaps the defense of a medium-specific understanding of artwork at this time mattered very little. At least this seems to be the case for Chen Hongshou, also called Chen Mancheng, who is the last artist I'll be introducing today. Chen was a former aide and mentee of Ren Yuan, our central figure, and his work best exemplifies the comprehensive dimensions of the turn toward touch that epigraphy inspired in the literati arts. His artistic explorations began with practices of seal carving and calligraphy that were based on the emulation of classical epigraphic sources, like the brick shown here in the middle, the style of which is emulated on the right, and the format and style of which is emulated in the seal carved with a knife directly into the stone on the left. His practice then grew to include painting, and in particular finger painting, a singularly tactile art, which, like seal carving with a knife, did away with the brush completely in favor of a more direct contact between body and material. He painted everything from landscapes to fruits and flowers with his finger, and in particular with a long fingernail. He wasn't the first to use this technique. But for Chen, the practice was directly intertwined with his training as an epigrapher and as an evidential scholar. Even in his paintings of fruits, his writings reveal an interest in classical linguistics. These inscriptions to the radishes at right read, "Rouge" is also written as rouge, listing two homophonous words with different characters used for describing the same material. Likewise, in a painting of loquats following the radishes in this collected album, Chen writes, "The peepah, or loquat fruit, is not the peepah, an instrument. They only called it that back then because they hadn't yet learned the word. If the peepah instrument could grow fruit, then flowers would soon be spouting from the ends of all the flutes in town." These short etymological asides only offer a muted reflection of the greater obsession with the forms of materiality of ancient language that Chen cultivated while working under Renyuan, and which was typical of most of the scholars of his generation. Whereas Renyuan's interest primarily manifested in the production of large scholarly catalogs of ancient inscriptions and the emulation of classical calligraphy styles in his own brushwork, Chen's fascination crossed material boundaries. When he moved to his own government position as a minor official in Zhejiang province, he developed a close connection to nearby potters in Yixing, and to Yang Pengnian in particular. Collaborating with artisans like Yang, Chen and his coterie of friends, many of whom were also former aides or disciples of Renyuan, produced customized teapots, inscribed with their calligraphy and paintings, and modeled after antique objects like the ceramic roof tiles and ancient bricks that we've seen already. When his teapots are considered alongside his finger painting and his seal carving, tactility really rises to the fore as the guiding sense for his artistic production, while the brushwork canons that had dominated older literati image-making fall almost entirely to the side. Chen, like the rest of his generation, was trained under the principles of evidential studies and was passionate about revitalizing the arts through the investigation of anonymously crafted objects from the deep past. Touch, through direct contact with the object or through rubbings that facsimilated that contact, was the primary means of affirming and exchanging knowledge, and a tactile thinking united the arts of this period. And so why does this matter to the history of Chinese art? I would propose that there are two reasons. For one, it complicates the old-fashioned notion that the arts of early 19th century China had stagnated, that they were ossified and mired in an obsession with the past that inhibited stylistic innovation and growth. Scholars of modern Chinese art largely begin their stories in the 1850s, grounding their narratives in relationship to the Opium Wars and to the Taiping Civil War, events that fundamentally redirected the path of Chinese history. One set of wars resulted in the forcible imposition of globally oriented trade policies favoring Western nations. The other war killed tens of millions and displaced just as many, rupturing the economies of China's heartland and fracturing Qing dynasty control over the empire. Over the next half-century, the latter part of the 19th century, the Qing government struggled to regain economic and political stability, eventually falling to revolutions that established the Republic of China in 1912. For most art historians of China, early 19th century artworks fail to attract interest because they offer only a pale reflection of the luxury and innovation of the 18th century and do not anticipate the coming changes of modern China. As the 20th century Chinese painter Xu Beihong put it in his 1918 essay, Methods for the Improvement of Chinese Painting, the deterioration of Chinese painting studies has reached its peak today. This was in 1918. Throughout the world, the principle of civilization is to avoid degeneration, and only Chinese painting today is 800 steps behind where it was 1,000 years ago. The passiveness of our people is really pitiable. How then was painting studies allowed to reach this ruined state? On the one hand, it was conservatism. On the other hand, it was a loss of an independent set of artistic skills. But by tracking the development of this tactile thinking from its roots in 18th century scholarly priorities of evidential research through the epigraphic aesthetic that united the arts of the early 19th century, we find that the past is not such a dark and stagnant place after all. The modern suggestion that the literati of Renyuan's generation were bound by tradition neglects to understand the terms of their own antagonism toward inherited canons of style. Early 19th century artists posed challenges to the hierarchies of received knowledge that were as radical as their 20th century counterparts, if not maybe more so. Secondly, I think this matters because it counteracts another easy narrative about art and modern China, that the impact of Western art and the adoption of its optical regimes at around the turn of the century is what mattered for 20th and 21st century Chinese art and art history. With the late 19th century influx of foreign ideas after the Opium Wars, an effect that was especially felt in the treaty ports like Shanghai, came new modes of depiction and reproduction that challenged older artistic paradigms, even including the notion of what an artist was and how they should act in relationship to their clientele, to their friends. Whereas 20th century painters like Xu Beihong, who was previously quoted, proposed that the solution to this so-called conservatism of later Chinese painting was a return to the visual realism of the Song dynasty, an optical engagement, early 19th century artists questioned the entire brushwork paradigm and instead aimed to return the arts of China to the roots of culture in the 2nd century and before. If they were traditionalists, then the tradition that they pursued was underpinned by a deeper questioning of the past than the modernists that later followed. Moreover, I think this research indicates a much greater continuity across 19th century and 20th century art in China than has previously been proposed. Many of the ideas and techniques touched upon by Ren Yuan and his circle of friends, scholars and artisans who pursued, let me back that sentence up. Many of the ideas and techniques touched upon by Ren Yuan and his circle of friends were later pursued in the late 19th and early 20th century by artists who did not understand the past as broken or the forms of modern visual art as dominant. Instead, they were much more interested in how these notions from the early 19th century of a tactile kind of thinking merged with new technologies. And this last aspect has only been made more apparent to me recently with my involvement in an upcoming edited volume, which Philip was kind enough to mention. The volume is about antiquarian practice in the greater Chinese sphere from the 1700s to the early 1900s. Several of the other scholars that are contributing to this book have revealed a proliferation of epigraphic interest at the turn of the 20th century, even as visual culture was pressured toward more optical engagement with modern Western advertisement and photographic forms of reproduction. As one example here, we see a set of hanging scrolls with bronzes with flora coming out of them, painted by Huang Shiling. A scholar based in San Diego named Tiffany Barris has done research on this artist, really very new research, that establishes Huang Shiling as somebody who was trained in a photography studio in the later part of the 19th century. And while these look very much like the kinds of three-dimensional rubbings that Liu Zhou was making, they are in fact entirely painted. They didn't touch the surfaces of these objects at all, suggesting that even as photographic technology was influencing the production of paintings and images like these, there's still a preference for the formats and ways of presenting materials that Liu Zhou had established. Another scholar named Zhu Yanfei, who's in Georgia, has written an essay about photolithographic reproductions of ancient bronzes that combined, again, photographic technology with rubbing technology and with lithography in various kinds of merged media, showing that the preference really for these older styles established in the early 19th century still stood at around the turn of the 20th century. Two young scholars, Eliza Chen and Helena Chen, co-wrote about Duanfang's photolithographic reproductions of rubbings of Egyptian monuments, bringing in a whole nother understanding of what the deep past was into the Chinese sphere in the early 20th century, but still using rubbing technology as the kind of fundamental form for understanding these new foreign ideas. And lastly, Ren Yue, who is a scholar at Dickinson College, has written about oil painters trained abroad and returning to China, who relied on rubbings of classical monuments to craft a new story of the evolution of art in China as separate from Western narratives of artistic progress. In the background, you can see a rubbing from those same Wuliang family shrines done in oil painting. Again, a kind of material facsimile, but now in this new modern form. The work of these new upcoming scholars, which will be soon published, suggests that the optical turn of the 20th century, that has been a kind of reliable way of describing the rise of modern 20th century Chinese art, would not have existed as we understand it without the foundation of earlier 19th century epigraphic aesthetics and this emphasis in particular on touch. And so to conclude, I'd like to thank you for letting me take you on this walk through the main themes of my recent book. Networks of Touch, A Tactile History of Chinese Art, 1790 to 1840. The book itself goes deeper into many of these issues, including the philosophical nature of touch and how it was established as a sense in relationship to the body. And it also expands on the examples that I've given you today in much more subtle ways than I had the time to express. Thank you for letting me give you the slightly rougher, more condensed version of it. I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Hatch. We have 2 microphones in the room. I'd ask that you just simply walk up to the microphone to pose your question, and Professor Hatch will answer. Just to get things started while others are lining up, I have 2 questions, I guess. One very simple. What are the colophons like on Liu Zhou's flower offering scroll? Do they reflect at all on, the use of the creation of penjing out of those bricks? What's the nature of the colophons? And then the other one is, it's just pure ignorance on my part. I've never really understood with Yuan and the other people of his generation with interest in epigraphy, how they kind of reconciled their interest in the work of these anonymous artisans with their own creation of calligraphic forms that at least we retrospectively identify as so distinctly personal. Like when you look at a Yuan couplet, or when you look at a Chen Hongshou couplet, at least today, you see it as distinctive, as somehow expressive of their personality in precisely the way that they seem to be rejecting by embracing anonymous artisans' calligraphy. So I just was wondering how that plays out, I guess, on a discursive level.
Great questions. I'm not sure I can provide full answers to those, Philip, but thank you for them. When it comes to that latter question, which is fun, were these guys hypocrites? Did they, or not hypocrites? Maybe that's a bit of an aggressive accusation to make. But in what ways did they acknowledge the fact that they were establishing a new kind of canon and a new personal idiom, even as they advocated for anonymous sources from the past? I don't remember any particular kind of self-reflection on this, but maybe another way to think of it is that, not as a sort of antagonism necessarily, or a kind of reaction, so much as that they were completely fine with creating their own idiom that was a personal style, so long as it didn't carry over any of the kind of mistakes of that past canon, right? That was the main goal of an evidential researcher, was to get back to the truer forms of the past, to get rid of all of the junk that had accumulated in between. And if they could harness that sense of authenticity, right, then it didn't matter that they were not being anonymous. The anonymity mattered to that move of harnessing the authority of the past. And once you had harnessed it, you could ride it wherever you wanted, I suppose, to complete that metaphor. When it comes to your first question, I have an embarrassing and difficult thing to admit, which is that I've never seen this in person. I've only seen it in reproductions. Which is not to say that I haven't read descriptions of the colophons on this painting, but there aren't that many actually attached to this artwork. When I spoke earlier about the kind of rich colophons that get attached to Liu Zhou's images, I was thinking in particular about Ren Yuan's addition to an object like this, in which he marvels at the kind of sense of tactility and touch. There are other examples of major poet, official painters like Tang Yifeng, who writes poems about Liu Zhou's painting, like big, long verse poems that are just extolling the virtues of of Liu Zhou's work. And in particular, in relationship to a handscroll that I didn't put in this slide, which I really love, of a little Buddhist reliquary from the 6th century that is only about this big, and it's this big, because it's reproduced in rubbings the way Liuzhou does in his hand scroll. And he's reproduced it in this fashion of doing these three-dimensional, manipulated forms. And then into the hand scroll, he's painted himself and his monk friends. Pardon me. Where is the best image to talk about this? It's a lot like this image. He's painted himself in miniature, bowing to the various sides, to the Maitreya Buddha, to the Bodhisattva of compassion, to all the different sides of this little stone votive sculpture, as if it were bigger than him. So he's created this microscopic world into which he can have this fantasy of praying to something that is actually handheld. And the colophons on that are really quite rich and delve into fascinating and somewhat understudied ideas about the way in which Buddhist notions of reproduction and of re-embodiment engage with this practice, because Liuzhou was a monk. And as far as I know, Eileen Xu, a scholar based in New York, is interested in pursuing that in some upcoming work. So hopefully we'll have more to say on that. There's a little bit in the book about it as well. Thank you for those great questions, Philip.
I was wondering, at the beginning, the main focus of your talk, this Liuzhou scroll. Mm-hmm. We know he was an itinerant artist, right? Being hired and go through the collection. So I'm very curious whether you can further contextualize this scroll. I mean, ultimately, what's the goal? What he's trying to, express? Whether there's a program, we know it's from somebody's collection, right? So it has all these brick, presumably mostly identifiable, and some are even dated, right? And also the floral added onto it, obviously it's not the same concept. It related to a bonsai, but I know this brick, each one is very solid. You cannot, unless you have extreme amount of effort to carve into a pot, you can pot something, right? So again, this is just an idea, right? Very, very literati. And so I'm just curious, what's the context, whether there's some kind of program? And after Liuzhou has done, he has the technique, right? Doing the three-dimensional rubbing for his, presumably his host or his patron, right? And is this his selection? And how was this, put together? What's behind his way of thinking? Was this a seasonal, floral thing involved, or something particularly symbolic? I see three friends of the winter, right? And also, ultimately, at the very end, has a long inscription. Can you, kind of tell us more about it? I'm also curious about the whole intellectual and social context behind it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, a wonderful question. I should speak into the microphone. And thank you for looking so closely and listening with me to the sort of introduction of this very strange hand scroll. So, to answer the broad question, why was this made, right? For whom was this made? We have to think about maybe a different way of understanding painting. This is something I've been playing with as a kind of more general idea, but this is a hybrid painting and rubbing combination, and what it documents is really a social gathering, right? Paintings in many ways, paintings like this, which were multiply authored, and which are justified or brought about by their original patron, Chen, saying, why don't we all gather, we'll paint into this reproduction of these bricks that my friend Liuzhou, who's staying with me at the Sanglang Pavilion, has made for me. And it unites these people in an object, right? It's like a node that is physical and real, and it can be brought out for later audiences, because the hand scroll doesn't hang permanently, right? It's brought out for showing. So when other friends come by at later years, they can look at this hand scroll, look at it together, and know that Chen Jian was together with the monk Song Xi, with Liu Zhou, with the painter and official Huang Zhen, because all of them have inscribed next to their paintings their presence here on that day, which was in the summer of 1835. And so we think of paintings often in a kind of contemporary museum context as something that are stable on the wall that we go and enjoy as a public, right, as part of our kind of civic or private, right, depending on the museum, to engage with the arts and be, uplifted by them, right. This kind of painting served a much different role, right. It united a particular set of people, improved their relationships to one another. It was networking, really. And the objects themselves and knowledge about these objects, this collection of bricks, was another way of kind of flexing the knowledge of the people gathered here on this day, not just how could they paint each of these things. And so the sort of why of this is really about the why of why we socialize with any friends, the way that we feel connection with anybody, right? There's a common vocabulary here. In this case, a very elite knowledge of the past, which has these political dimensions to it. The idea of rectifying the mistakes that had been inherited in textual recensions of things as important as the analects. And here is the kind of minor scale, that sort of fetishization of these objects by which you could make these linguistic arguments or alterations to really fundamental texts. So the why of this, and that inscription on the end, which is in the same kind of style as the brick inscriptions, is by Liu Zhou. The why of this is because there was a party, and people got together and wanted to create something to commemorate it. That's a sort of glib answer. But the seriousness of these is in their ability to convey those social networks through presence, tactile presence, and the kind of brushwork presence of each of these people who contributed to it at the invitation of one person, Chen Jian, the guy who gathered these people together, the party's host. I'm not sure if that entirely answers the question, but I've rambled and I think circled back onto my ideas once or twice in this comment, so I'll be happy to talk to you afterward if I missed any part of your great question.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and I really like how you both highlights the visual quality in the visual representation, but at the same time decenter the only visual function in the whole discourse. And my question is really about the play of scale in this whole reprographic process. As you showed a really wonderful example of the miniature figure, but at the same time, when we are looking at the composite robbing, it doesn't usually the actual size, and people sometimes think it's the photographic of the original object, but actually sometimes it's shrink, and we can see that evidences, for example, the Maogongding robbing is not a real size. So it has to be a intended choices, and I just wonder how you think of that as a challenge for thinking about a multi-sensorial engagement, as this is still dominated by the trompe-l'oeil require. But at the same time, it maybe lead us to a new understanding of tactile contact, as this is not only a simple surface-to-surface contact, but another relationship between object and figure, people and viewer. So thank you.
Can I clarify one thing? The Maoding is the photo reproduction, right? Or the one for Renyuan. Which one are you talking about? Is it?
I'm just curious whether these are the photographic, the same size reproduction, and how in general, conceptually and theoretically, we understand the play of scale in these robbings.
Great. Thank you for that question, Fayar. So I remembered one thing from the previous question that I wanted to add, the idea that sometimes classical bricks were actually hollowed out and made into things, like this inkstone, which was converted from an original masonry brick, like the ones in the ink scroll that we were looking at. So that is an answer to the previous question. You could possibly make a penjing, although it would be a very shallow one, out of most of the bricks that we're talking about. But to come to Feor's question about scale, that is an important thing to keep in mind because, again, to make the rubbing of something so that it was in this facsimile of 3 dimensions, but only in 2, right? The full form, or Chen involved certain kinds of fictions, I guess you could say, right? These aren't exact rubbings of the surface, because if you exactly rub the surface, the object would splay out, right? And so only certain parts of the object are rubbed and the rest are painted in. But usually it's the inscription zones that have the most interest on part of the viewers, because they're the part that contributes to this larger question of evidential research. Those are almost directly rubbed. And in the photolithographic reproductions, which again are sometimes a combination of, there's an example I should have put in here, this is the wrong one, of an actual photograph of the Yuding with a rubbing embedded into it, where the whole thing is then reproduced in photolithographic form. And there's a certain kind of interesting irony that a stone is used, photolithographic, to transfer all of the process as well, even though it's of a bronze. But that's a kind of twisted way of creating a connection. So the sort of strictest answer is these are not exact versions of the thing. There's some sort of a combination that at least alludes to the real dimensions of the object. And I think it's that fiction, the perception that it actually is or has touched the real object and is in an exact one-to-one scale that is important. But as you point out, sometimes there's even a further transition that happens. So Liu Zhou also has used woodblock prints to create facsimiles of rubbings when the whole form is either too encrusted or too difficult to reproduce in this 3-dimensional full-form rubbing fashion, especially of bronzes like this. There is a scholar in Hangzhou named Wang Yifeng, who has written a whole book about Liu Zhou. And he has done meticulous visual analysis of these objects, even noting where sometimes papers have been pasted in together to create the semblance, right? That the object has had direct contact, that it is a rubbing that sits in the image at the exact one-to-one scale of the original object. When it comes to things like that Buddhist reliquary, there are all sorts of weird compressions of the rubbings of the original object that take place that, again, are made to look like and to encourage the understanding that the portions of the object that are exactly rubbed from the real thing are part of a complete whole, of a kind of real direct contact with the object. So even when those fictional filling in moments happen, even when there's a kind of bastardization of this actual contact with the real object, I think the fiction is maintained, and that's important for the viewership of objects like this. And this one is especially doctored up and painted in, but the inscription has been rubbed and shifted as well. So again, the idea here is that the attention moves toward this act of touch, and you can see Liu Zhou here, really actually physically touching in this miniature version the surfaces of the goosefoot lamp, which is supposedly at direct scale when you're viewing the hand scroll. And here he is cleaning out the individual characters, which in the original object, which is this big, are minuscule. He shrinks himself down so as to better attend to and clarify the script, which is so important to him. Again, I hope that's answered some of the question. I'm happy to talk more about it.
Thank you very much, Professor Hatch, for your wonderful presentation. So I have several questions. So first is, do you think the Song predecessors of Runyuan's circle, for example, do they also have a network of touch view, using the conceptual framework you're using. And the second question is about the sense of touch. As a literary scholar, I always feel fascinated about how Chinese literati kind of conceptualize about different senses. And surprisingly, I found how few and how little, the discussion, the discourse on touch in pre-modern China. And I wonder whether you're using the modern, contemporary Western view of touch and apply that to, Ren Yuan's circle, or you also see themselves have some discussions about touch as a sense, because according to your presentation, your book, and I think it's, when you talk about touch, it's mostly about the human handling through, using their hands. So, yeah, I just wonder whether you have more something to say about touch and sense. And the third question is, I wonder whether so when Ren Yuan and Chen Hongshou and Liu Zhou, their circle, compose, create their artworks, I wonder whether they actually have the touch experience of handling those objects, or sometimes they're just, how to say, like kind of viewing. So the ancient epigraphical records of the past, instead of handling those physical objects. So these are my questions. Thank you very much.
Wonderful questions, and a great sort of methodological point that I left out of this speech, because I thought maybe getting into the nitty-gritty of understanding the nature of the senses in classical Chinese thought would be a bit too much to add to this. But I did my best to avoid imposing a Western sense of the senses and touch. And there are a couple of scholars that I look to in particular for this. There's someone named Jane Genie. I'm not actually, it's Geaney. I think she's at the University of Richmond, who's done good work on the notion of the senses in early Chinese thought. And someone named Jana Roschker, who I think is based somewhere in Western Europe, who's thought about epistemology and its relationship to the senses in earlier Chinese thought. And the short of it is, and if you want the full written instead of the kind of partially digested, remembered version that I'm about to give you, you can actually download the introduction to the book completely free off of the Penn State University Press website. And in that introduction is where I do my best to outline my understanding of the senses. And in that part of the book, I also acknowledge the fact that there isn't much work that helps us to understand the nature of the senses in early Chinese thought, or even in later Chinese thought in the 19th century. And I think maybe that's all the more reason to pay attention to something like this. But the short of it is, the earlier notion of the senses uses a metaphor, and you find it in, Jiangsu and Shunzi, metaphors of government officials, the 5 government officials who have direction over the senses in the body. And what's most interesting about touch, as you rightly point out, is that it's not actually centered in the hand, in these early texts at least. Touch is centered in the skin and all over the body. And so the entire surface of the body is a sensing mechanism of touch in most of the early writers, as far as I could understand through secondary scholarship, through contemporary scholarship on the topic. I haven't done and I'm probably not capable actually of doing my own kind of analysis, if I'm being very frank, of those early texts to understand the context and sort of move against the secondary scholarship understandings of the senses, and so I rely on them. But the sense of touch, again, is distributed over the whole body, which is a fascinating way to think about it, that is in contrast to the kind of haptic or hand-centered notion that we see at least on display here. And it relates to work as well by Michael Nyland at UC Berkeley, whose most recent tome on pleasure talks about the way in which pleasure and the senses interact. And I talk about that a little bit in my introduction as well. The idea that pleasure is centered in this kind of reception of particularly the physical contact and touch of the body. Again, I elaborated on a little more clearly in that introduction, but you can go download that for free. To come to your other question about Song Dynasty, epigraphy and rubbings, you just don't see the extent of it that you see here. Yes, it is a major thing. Jiangsu and all of those major writers, poets, scholars of the Song period are going out and collecting things, but as a lot of people who have described what's going on in the early 19th century have argued, they're not actually going out to sites, they're not actually interacting with things in person, and I think that's the root of your question as well. These guys were fondling things, right? Ren Yuan talks about it in his inscription on, where are you now? This, that when he looks at this, he knows it's the right proportions, which comes back to Fayar's question, because he has held the original in his hand. So there's a memory there, of course, but he's talking about his own physical sensorial experiences that confirm what he's visually engaging with. And this triangulation of memory, touch, and sight that he writes about in this inscription, I think allows us to understand these as actually having been touched by the collectors, by the people who talked about them. There's a lot of work on Huang Yi and his work to go out into the field and excavate and pull together remnants of the past. He was certainly very physically involved, along with his various kinds of assistants and aides in making rubbings and collecting these objects. So I tend to believe that they aren't just talking about it, that they're actually doing it based on that evidence. And I do think that it is more involved, more tactily engaged, and again, more interested in incorporating touch into the other arts, as I've tried to show with examples like Liu Zhou or Chen Hongshou, whose overall interest in touch, I think, is a through line in his art, even if he might not explicitly talk about it in those conceptual terms. Thanks for the question. Happy to talk more about it.
Great. If there aren't any more questions, let's thank Professor Hatch for this engaging talk and extremely engaging responses to all of our questions. Thank you so much, Professor Hatch.
Thank you.
And our next lecture for the East Asian Garden Studies series will be in November. I think it's November 17th or so. Michael Stanley Baker from Singapore will be coming to talk about the circulation of early medieval plant medicines in China.